Warning. The following episode contains subject matter and scenes that some viewers may find upsetting, disturbing, or unnerving. Please note, viewer discretion is advised at all times. Sit back and enjoy.
A masterpiece.
What do you reckon? What should happen to him? Fucking kill him.
A triumph.
What, you're gonna go and kill the rest of the world?
Brilliant. Extraordinary. With a smash hit box office of $1.3 million, directed by Justin Kurzel in his directorial debut, winner of Critics' Week at Cannes Film Festival and Chicago International Film Festival, this is Snowtown. A dark journey of addiction and violence. A story of bodies in barrels. An ending without resolution. But this isn't fiction. This is real life. This is Snowtown.
Hello and welcome back to another I Could Murder a podcast, the podcast that makes you go, I'm talking murder, manhunts, mystery, mayhem, the macabre, mildly funny banter, and also me and Mr. Ben Carter.
That was so good. Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and it's great to be back in Australia.
Yeah, we are back in Australia once again with today's episode. And today, well, before we get into that, Ben, where can people find us if they want to follow us on the socials?
Let's run through the honours. So Instagram at Could Murder a Pod.
Yes.
Twitter at Could Murder a Pod.
Yes. We've also got a Facebook, I Could Murder a Podcast on Facebook, and we also have a Patreon for anyone who's hungry for extra content. We do minisodes over there, and we let you guys pick a minisode and vote for it. So we've got 34 cases on there. 35. A lot. Big thank you to anyone already supporting us over there, and big thank you to anyone who's gonna.
And just by becoming one of our Patreon backers, you also unlock exclusive discount to our merchandise store, which is www.icmap.store.
Yes, indeed. You know, over there we've got badges, we've got stickers, we've got hats, we've got mags, we've got a lot of things over there. And any support there as well is very much appreciated. How you doing, Danny?
Very good, thanks. Very good. Thank you very much.
Perfect. That's what we needed, the energy there. Today's case, Ben, like you said, we are in Australia once again. We were there for Catherine night before.
We were.
It was very eerie, and I'm sorry to say, this case is no less eerie.
It's clearly eerie this week. A very, very bleak, very dark case. Research-wise, this was up there in terms of depravity.
Yep. Another fancy word? Do you want to put another one on there?
Disillusional.
Pardon?
No. Dark.
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 Is that why you're dressed in black today?
Could well be. Could well be. An homage to a dark case.
Yep.
So this week is the case of the Snowtown Murders, also known as the Bodies in the Barrels Murders. And it's a dark one. It's one we've had quite a few requests to cover kind of consistently since we started the podcast. I've got a couple of different memories of this case. Back in 2010, went on a little Greyhound bus up and down the east coast of Australia. A lot of people talking about it then. And secondly, back when DVDs were a thing.
You still can get them.
Back when DVDs were an acceptable Christmas present, I used to get my brother, who's big into his horror movies, kind of 4 or 5 DVDs every year. I just used to Google terms like creepiest movie ever, scariest movie ever, darkest movie ever. And Snowtown came up frequently. I watched it and that stuck with me, that movie. Very bleak, very haunting. And Today we're going to tell you all about that case.
Yeah, I've seen the film as well. I remember watching it back in the day, and it
stays with you.
It does stay with you. Interesting fact about the film, a lot of the actors in it are just locals from the town itself and not actually trained actors. Take that to the bank. Anyway, as we always...
Foreshadowing.
Two words that people have been saying they don't want you to say this series is doxing and foreshadowing. And I, for one, I'm on their side.
So I definitely don't recall it having such a high victim count. That was one thing that stood out. But just every person in this case is to an extent somewhat of a victim.
It's a very dark case, and I was also surprised by the victim count.
One thing to further outline how bleak this week's case is in the documentaries, or the informative kind of suitable for most audience documentaries, there was a recreation, and I winced at how horrible the recreation was, and that was just for kind of one of those kind of, I think it was a 15 plus audience one, but still, I had me squeamish, Tom. Had me very squeamish.
Okay, enough about you. Should we get in the case? So for this case, it's a bit different to a normal kind of case, because usually there's one perpetrator. This is actually kind of a group. The group kind of changes as it goes, which we'll go into, but there's kind of two people that stayed constant within that: John Bunting and Robert Wagner. And we are going to go into their background and kind of see where their paths crossed, and also see if there's any red flags along the way that led them to where they ended up.
So John Justin Bunting was born on the 4th of September 1966, and he was born, Tom, without a sense of smell.
So whilst doing the research for this, I saw that as well. He was born without it, but also it's been kind of debated whether he had an illness for a short time when he was a child, and then he lost the sense of smell. The thing about the sense of smell with Bunting, this would actually weirdly kind of become a bit of a superpower later on, I'd say.
So Bunting is the kind of ringleader of the group. I mean, and if you look at him and look at pictures of him before and after his arrest, he doesn't strike you as the most kind of traditional leader. Very charismatic, very manipulative, but we'll get on to that. He was born in Inala, Queensland, which is a suburb just south of Brisbane, and it's a very much a working class, multicultural part of Brisbane, which was apparently a hotbed for crime at the time.
Yeah, and lots of unemployment, so it's a difficult kind of place to grow up. And also, you're witnessing things day to day, which can also, affect your kind of thought process and the way you view things. So he was raised in a kind of, a slightly rougher area of Australia.
They initially kind of built Inala up as the idea of being a kind of a thriving community where there'd be lots of opportunities for people. It was a place to house their retired military servicemen and women as well. But in the end, it turned into somewhat of a ghetto. Bunting was the only child of Tom and Jan Bunting, who were two working class individuals. Anything they had, he was the only child, so anything they had in the family they would give to him. But it was said that his mother very much ruled the household. She towered over the father. The mother was a secretary and the father worked in a printing factory.
So during his childhood, this is straight away a bit of a concern. He used to kind of like to torture insects by putting them into little bits of acid. I'm just kind of watching them just slowly dissolve. He kind of would make different concoctions to see what would happen to them. Again, this is something that would come up later on. It reminded me when I was little, I used to often try and make George's Marvellous Medicine by taking some shampoo and like different creams.
I wondered where you were going there.
I did exactly the same, Tom, by the way.
Did you?
That is amazing.
Yeah, just make it pour it onto the thing, stir it up. And I always thought, if I have a bite of this, I'd probably something would happen, but I didn't. Just wasting my parents' money there. Good memories.
He would often place different ants and spiders in different acids, bleaches. He was also into photography, so he had photography development fluids that would also serve to torture these animals with it, or these insects within. So yeah, he would often place them in these different concoctions, pop a drinking glass over the top of them and watch the insects suffer.
So when Bunting was 8 years old, he went to a friend's house, and he was actually sexually assaulted by the brother, and so was his friend. Apparently this was a slow, horrible experience and was only stopped when the dad came home. Now, this moment, I think, is a very key moment within his childhood and kind of really shaped how he viewed people and, people who would abuse people. Obviously, it's going to have a long-lasting effect, and I think this is something that really kind of sets his mindset going forward.
Yeah, he wasn't able to deal with kind of, what he viewed the shame of that attack on him, but also the physical and emotional pain that caused. And then I believe when he was finally freed, because he was bound to the bed, he went home and he was late home to dinner, and his mother then further beat him for arriving late. So it was just, a fairly vicious cycle. He didn't feel like he had anyone to talk to about what he'd gone through.
So interestingly, there was actually a study done in the University of Israel about sexual abuse at a young age and how much it can affect the brain. These studies would actually go on to show that it can have a similar impact to a traumatic brain injury. So a lot of cases you hear about the frontal lobe being damaged, and then people kind of changing drastically how they act and how they behave and losing empathy and whatnot. But it's been reported that this kind of abuse can really affect the brain's development and really change the way they kind of view things.
Definitely. And with Bunting, he was most likely repressing this. He didn't have any siblings he could talk to, any friends he could really talk to. His mum and dad he felt ashamed of going to. And he was kind of very much isolated in his suffering at the time, which you can imagine the type of impact that would have had. So this assault was the older brother of one of Bunting's good school friends, and apparently that particular older brother had been frequently abusing his own brother. At one point, had Bunting tied to the bed, they would sexually assault him, but they would also burn cigarettes into the side of his face. Which is something that Bunting would pick up in his later years as well, but inflicting it on other people. So there's a very striking encounter in John's teenage life. Now, I've only managed to find a little bit of information about this, so it's very much alleged. But apparently at 13 years old, John meets a middle-aged man named Benny. And Benny at the time had lived through a kind of similar upbringing to John in that he was abused. He actually had both of his big toes cut off with garden shears by his own abusive father. Now, apparently, John went to Benny seeking protection from any other kind of assaults or abuse. And in return for protection, Benny asked John to act as bait on the street corners where they would lure essentially paedophile predators to a dark alley or down the side of the street, where then Benny and John would take it in turns in attacking and almost beating to death these individuals that they would manage to kind of trick down this side street. Again, it's alleged, there's not a lot of information on it, but that, if it did happen, would definitely kind of show you some insight into the way that John's mind was working. So this Benny individual and John would often break into the homes of known sex offenders in the area, and they would trash and ransack the houses, often urinating over furniture and writing the F word in excrement on the walls, which was
their own excrement?
I'd imagine so.
So throughout his teen years, Bunting was very interested in general anatomy, photography and weaponry of all types. This kind of led him into researching weapons in history, which would then lead into World War I and World War II and the Nazis, white supremacy, and he became fascinated with that book that a lot of people tend to get fascinated with, Mein Kampf. Similar to Ian Brady and many other sick individuals. He got very into those extreme ideas, kind of torture, and was just fascinated with Nazism in general. He actually painted a swastika on his car, but his mum made him remove it.
Yeah, I heard that the mum actually just painted over it. So I was trying to imagine that scenario. Maybe she didn't want to cause a scene, quickly paint over it.
I heard that she made him remove it.
As he goes into his later teenage years, Bunting is starting to harbour a strong hatred for paedophiles and homosexuals, and he did not actually tend to kind of distinguish between the two. He very much kind of tarred them with the same brush. He also developed a strong hatred for authority. It's alleged that he had authority defiance disorder, which is a new one for me. And at a very young age, he was displaying both psychopathic and sociopathic traits.
So in 1986, when John was 20, he moved to Adelaide and had a job at the crematorium. Again, this is a common theme with a lot of people that we tend to study. You've got Gacy working in the morgue. You've got Sutcliffe working as a grave digger. Fascinated in bodies, fascinated in death. I guess it makes sense. But yeah, he was working there. But then at 22, he worked at the SA Meat Corporation. And he would brag about slaughtering animals to his friends and people around there, saying that's what he enjoyed doing the most. But the records from the slaughterhouse actually show that wasn't his job on the line. He wasn't killing animals there. But he liked to kind of portray that that's kind of what he did.
Yeah, he'd be very graphically describing what he'd been up to at work when he got home. Apparently, he would arrive at the dinner table with very bloodied and bruised hands. But again, if he was just packing or delivery driver, any other roles at a slaughterhouse? Supervisor.
Maybe in the canteen.
Maybe.
The roles.
So during this time, he was sharing a house with his friends Kevin Reed and Kevin's girlfriend. And during this time, it's alleged that Bunting killed Kevin's terrier bulldog.
So in September 1989, when Bunting was 23, he would go on to meet Veronica Tripp. He met her in a metalworking class when she was 18 years old. She had a teenage son called Jamie and Troy, and Bunting would go on to marry Veronica.
Yeah, and he was, well, I mean, we'll go into some more detail when we talk about Jamie, but Bunting was essentially the father figure both boys never had.
Yeah.
They had a very abusive upbringing, very abusive biological fathers and stepfathers, and Bunting was kind of everything that both Veronica and her sons were kind of dreaming of.
Yeah, he seemed like the answer to their prayers there, but not quite how it all would turn out.
Metal school as well, metal class.
Metal working class.
Sparks were flying?
Yep, guess there were, Ben. So in 1991, they moved back to Salisbury North, which is a suburb in Adelaide, and this is where they would go on to meet new neighbours Barry Lane and Robert Joe Wagner.
So, Robert Joe Wagner was born on the 28th of November 1971 in Parramatta, New South Wales. Wagner came from a broken home. His father left the household shortly after he was born. He was very much academically challenged in terms of his performance at school. He failed most courses and eventually dropped out. While all of this was going on as well, Wagner was sexually abused by both his stepfather and a teenage neighbour on the street that he lived in, which actually at one stage made Wagner suicidal. So he was in a really dark place, and at the age of 14, he met 30-year-old Barry Lane.
So Barry Lane was a kind of a known child predator around the time, but he somehow managed to convince Wagner that they were a couple and were in love with one another.
Well, he groomed him, didn't he?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he groomed him. The two disappeared together, went into hiding, and resurfaced once Wagner was of a more respectable age for them to be in a relationship together. It was a very kind of, seemed to be Barry Lane saw an opportunity there with someone who was already very psychologically vulnerable, and he saw an opportunity there to kind of groom him.
Definitely, because physically he was quite a tall guy, Wagner. I mean, his friends and colleagues at the fire service that he'd eventually go on to work at nicknamed him Lurch. Tall. From
I know where it's from.
The Addams Family.
So just a bit of context, this friendship made by Bunting and his two neighbours is a very, very unlikely friendship to kind of happen. Obviously, Bunting growing up, he had a strong hatred towards the gay community as well as kind of predators, and he could obviously see the age difference between Wagner and Lane as well. So him making friends with them is very odd. Some people can kind of theorise perhaps it's just because it's a neighbour, it's easier, or some people thought it could actually be because knowing those two people, he would then be able to find out who else was gay, or perhaps who else was a predator, and then he could
utilise their network.
Yeah.
It was also alleged that the Bunting saw something in Wagner and believed that Wagner actually wasn't gay and that he wanted to rescue and save Wagner from Lane. But I mean, Wagner and Lane had gone through very similar experiences to what Bunting and Benny would do. So their house had been burgled and vandalised multiple times. They would have things sprayed on their fences and front doors and walls. The pair also, Wagner and Lane, kept a Doberman and 2 Alsatians, and rumours were ripe in the town that there was at times elements of bestiality going on behind closed doors. But again, that could have been people that were vandalising their house and did not approve of their relationship, simply kind of spreading negative news around town, spreading rumours.
The other thing about Wagner was he did share a mutual interest with Bunting. He also worshipped Hitler. So him and Bunting would actually go on to join an extremist group called National Action, which is a kind of far-right movement over in Australia. The group found Wagner and Bunting too extreme and actually would kick him out, which, that's like a guitarist joining Slipknot and them saying, mate, you're too heavy. Get out of the band. So yeah, it goes to show if a far-right group is thinking your thoughts are too extreme, exactly what kind of things were they trying to spout out and push there.
Yeah, as far as extremist groups went, they were very radical and too radical for that particular group, I believe, as well. Wagner had gone to local tattoo parlours wanting to get a swastika tattooed onto his forehead. And with Bunting, there are elements of Charlie Manson that's kind of similarities in terms of manipulating maybe less intelligent people or people he feels he can control or get under his spell. But local tattoo parlours would refuse Bunting and Wagner because they didn't want to suffer the consequences of people finding out now that they'd done that. But I think that was just a small part of, you know, their beliefs and how much they were pushing it once they joined that group. So Barry Lane also had an interest in cross-dressing, and he would dress up in women's clothes and kind of lived a life by one of his alter egos, which was simply named Vanessa. He had a history in which he'd sexually abused 2 12-year-old boys before, and he only served 4 months for those assaults, which I think is a very short sentence. He would often be seen around town and in full dress, but he would only kind of become Vanessa, so to speak, once or twice a month, and Bunting was still aware of this, but still continued to kind of pursue a friendship with the couple.
Bunting was very, very close friends with both of them. Or I think more Wagner. I think he kind of just put up with Barry, just to kind of remain friends with Wagner. And by this stage, you know, they're sharing ideologies together. They're discussing, you know, their mutual hatreds for the people they have, and also, you know, Bunting's kind of learning about who locally, like, you know, his network's expanded in terms of people he knows locally who perhaps are gay or who he thinks are child predators. And he's at a stage now where his brain's kind of working overtime in terms of like what he kind of wants to do, and his anger and kind of is building up.
Bunting has arrived into Salisbury North an absolute hero as well, because family absolutely idolise him. He's made friends in the neighbourhood very, very quickly. He's viewed as this really kind of charismatic leader, as we mentioned, and everything in his life is on the up. But things are going to take a quite a drastic turn. As we're going to go into our timeline now.
The timeline.
Timeline! Hit that timeline music.
Bum, 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 bum.
16th of August 1992. The first victim was 18-year-old Clinton Trezise, who was openly gay and at the time in a relationship with Barry Vanessa Lane. After Wagner and Lane had broken up, the two formed a bit of a bond. One day, Bunting invited Clinton round to his home for drinks. As the pair were sat down, Bunting attacked Clinton from behind with a shovel, hitting him in the back of the head, and he fell to the floor immediately. So Bunting, in carrying out this attack, was accusing Trezise of being a paedophile, though there was no evidence to kind of back this up. Lane and Wagner helped Bunting dispose of the body in a shallow grave alongside Middle Beach Road at Lower Light, South Australia. Bunting wouldn't kill again for the next 3 years.
So obviously that's Bunting's first kind of, you know, his first person he's killed, and as well, it's someone that he has no evidence of being a paedophile. He's just kind of thought, oh, he's gay, therefore he must be, and he's got Lane and Wagner involved straight away, which, even though they obviously were hanging out and whatnot, they're now implicated within the crime. Yeah. So they're kind of in on this like dark secret they all have with one another. Bunting would actually call Clinton Happy Pants, was the kind of nickname he had for him, which sounds quite an affectionate name, but you know, you can imagine with his kind of the way he thought about gay people, it was done in kind of spiteful way.
Gritted teeth.
Yeah, and because Clinton was known for wearing bright red and bright purple trousers, it's just a sign there. Well, obviously Clinton trusted Bunting enough to go to his house for drinks, and then him attacking him from behind. There's also signs of like of Clinton trying to defend himself because he had like a fractured hand. But this incident shook Lane up afterwards. As we said, Wagner and Lane were kind of called in on it, but there's evidence to suggest that Lane was very shook up from this, as Clinton was supposedly one of his friends, obviously. That's the big thing in this. Obviously, he was having a relationship with him at the time. So he confided in Bunting's wife, telling her what happened, but asking her not to mention it to Bunting, as he feared what he may do to them.
Yeah, that's the fit. And so I think it was his left hand that was completely fractured, as well as the back of his skull completely caved in. Though the attack was completely kind of unprovoked and seemingly escalated out of nowhere, the kind of more devious part of this is that Clinton was somewhat of a drifter. So he would kind of move from town to town, he'd go away on trips, and he also, potentially due to being homosexual, was kind of abandoned by his family.
Yeah, he wasn't very close to his family. And as you said, him kind of disappearing and moving around, it wouldn't be crazily out of character for him to not be in town the next day, and he wouldn't have much contact with his parents. So it wasn't a case of like people wouldn't notice if he was missing for a certain period of time. Yeah,
they'd just assume he's gone on another trip, and that would be that. But we'll come back to Clinton at the end of the episode, because there's some interesting little bits about that particular incident.
So in 1993, Elizabeth Harvey, a 40-year-old single mum, moves herself and 2 sons to Salisbury North. Elizabeth had also experienced abuse as a child when a seemingly charming neighbour, Geoffrey Payne, offered to look after her 2 young sons. Elizabeth couldn't believe her luck. Little did Elizabeth know that Jeffrey Paine was a convicted paedophile. From November 1993 to January 1994, Paine would sexually abuse Elizabeth's sons Jamie and Troy. Eventually, Elizabeth was warned by concerned neighbours about Paine, and she put a stop to the abuse, which saw her get arrested. So this abuse deeply affected Jamie, like Ben mentioned earlier on. Their kind of childhood wasn't very happy anyway, with parents kind of abusing them, and then the new neighbour and the new town when they moved to.
Yeah, it was alleged Troy also abused Jamie as well. And yeah, Bunting arrives at the perfect time almost for him, but he was massively affected by this abuse, and he would actually shower obsessively, scrubbing his skin so hard that he would in fact draw blood.
Yeah, so yeah, Jamie's had a horrible time of it. And yeah, this is the moment where Bunting would actually go on to meet Elizabeth and her sons. So 1994, Bunting got wind of what happened to Elizabeth and her sons. With his ever-growing hatred for paedophiles, he took it upon himself to become a protector of Elizabeth and her boys. And after spending time with the family, it wasn't long until he became romantically involved with Elizabeth.
So yeah, it's a very poignant scene in the Snowtown movie itself, but also this is alleged to have been like for like. Bunting is on the front porch of Jeffrey Paine, and he's on a motorbike, and this is in the middle of the night, immediately revving his bike up, dust going everywhere, a lot of noise, and he pulls out and displays the fact that he has a weapon on him. So Paine immediately isolates within his home, and he's not seen for days. So at the time, Bunting had a relationship with his wife Veronica, and that was very much on the rocks. So he was hardly ever at home with her and spent most of his time now with Elizabeth. Jamie enjoyed having a strong male role model in the house, which is something he hadn't had all of his life, predominantly one that would not betray his trust. As his older brother Troy had allegedly also sexually abused him, Bunting took Jamie under his wing and would make him watch as he killed and skinned stray cats and dogs, potentially to, kind of harden him up, I guess.
Yeah, I think you could think maybe, but that's something Bunting enjoyed, and he was kind of trying to share one of his enjoyments. It was a very dark thing to share, but yeah, he kind of saw Jamie, maybe saw a bit of himself in Jamie in terms of a young boy who's had a really rough time with it, and he wanted to protect him and make sure he was okay. And Jamie, yeah, as you said, like his stepbrothers betrayed his trust, his dad's betrayed his trust. It's like he's not had a male role model who's looked out for him and kind of done right by him. So he's kind of seeing, this guy, maybe he is a bit strange with this stuff, but everything else is all...
Yeah, and timing wise for Bunting, it couldn't have been any better. He's very impressionable at this point, he's very vulnerable, and I think Bunting again has seen a chance to potentially manipulate another person. Yeah.
So again in 1994, Trezise's body is found but remains unidentified for another 5 years. The police do not yet link this murder to Bunting. The $100,000 reward wasn't claimed, so there's a big kind of price put on that. But yeah, there wasn't enough evidence there for them to kind of recognise the body. Bunting would boast to Jamie about his dark deed when the body was shown on an episode of Australia's Most Wanted. So this is like kind of the first time revealing to Jamie his twisted world, what he's done before, and he's very proud of it. And obviously we said with having Bunting having Jamie under his kind of wing, Bunting would go on to show Jamie his wall of spiders, which is something he nicknamed this notice board he had in his bedroom, which basically had names, notes and blue string kind of linking between them, kind of a bit like a web, which was
Charlie and It's Always Sunny.
Yeah.
Bird law. I think it was bird law.
It has a lot of things, doesn't it? The string.
String.
Yeah. Linking all these local homosexual men who he also believed to be paedophiles. He didn't seem to have much. Anyone who was gay seemed to think, he's also a paedophile. And he would call them dirties. He'd often ring these men at night and shout abuse down the phone, and also go on to vandalise their property. The reason for it being called the Wall of Spiders is rock spider is an Australian slang term for paedophile, usually used in prisons.
And I think that part where you talked about them watching an episode of Australia's Most Wanted, and they're literally, this is how impressionable Jamie is at the time. They're literally sat there and I imagine kind of captivated by the story, and Bunting kind of leans back and goes, you see that? That was me. But Jamie's really buying it and impressed by it, whereas anyone else would probably take it with a pinch of salt, I imagine.
A lot of speculation there, but...
So December 1995, Ray Davies, a man with severe learning disabilities who was known for exposing himself to children, was also an acquaintance of Lane's, was beaten to death by Wagner and Bunting after one of Bunting's neighbours, Suzanne Allen, discovered that he had been sexually abusing two of her young nephews, or she had alleged that this was the case in any form. Davies was in a relationship with Suzanne Allen, and once they had broke up, moved into a caravan in her backyard. At the time of his murder, Davies was renting a property 79 miles away. Bunting and Wagner drove to that particular house, beat him primarily in the genital area, and then drove back to Bunting's house, where Elizabeth Harvey joined them in torturing him and subsequently killing him.
So yeah, that's obviously, they've now made their group of 3 into a group of 4 there, bringing Elizabeth Harvey in, which obviously she's been around Bunting for a long time now and she's kind of seen what he's like, but it's kind of, you know.
It's another escalation.
Yeah.
So Davies was then buried in Bunting's back garden, and he was never officially reported as missing. While the group were torturing Davies and he was very close to death, Bunting allegedly asked Elizabeth, "Do you like your present?" So back to the lady that had initially raised the concerns around Ray Davies, Bunting went back to Suzanne Allen and told her that they had scared Davies away and that she didn't need to worry about him anymore. Bunting and his gang would use Davies' debit card to withdraw his fortnightly welfare payments. So again, when family were checking in or raising any concerns to the police, they would check his kind of digital footprint or his banking accounts, and they would kind of verify that they were still being withdrawn, so that therefore he must still be alive.
So that's kind of a pattern later on they would take as well. Whilst doing these kind of torture, they would obtain information from the people, and you know, enough for them to be able to take the welfare checks, and then the kind of thing they could, like financial gain they could get from these deaths as well, which kind of also makes you think it wasn't always just about them thinking, you know, they were trying to make money from this.
Yeah, that's the really interesting thing about this case. As they go on to claim more victims, the motive kind of changes, but also the kind of type of victims that they were attacking or targeting would also change.
Yeah. So in 1996, Bunting, Elizabeth and her children moved back to Baccara. Suzanne Allen, who was in love with Bunting, visited the house one weekend where she and Bunting slept together. Bunting then told her there was nothing between them, and she returned home but continued to write emotional letters to him. Bunting stayed in Baccara with Elizabeth for a few months before moving the family to Murray Bridge. So yeah, I mean, perhaps it's because, you know, he saved Suzanne Allen, or he was, you know, the hero there. A lot of women did seem to gravitate towards Bunting, you know, kind of underlining how charming people found him. I mean, he's not exactly Johnny Depp, but he seems to be getting a lot of women very interested in him.
Yeah, and again, he's going for the vulnerable types, so often single mothers or people that are going through kind of abusive relationships. So he is very much trying to look like the hero, the man that saves the day, and that's something that he would continue to try and do. So despite leaving her love letters unanswered, Bunting drove down to visit Allen with Wagner, only to find her in her bathroom dead from a heart attack, although this is obviously, you know, Bunting's side of the story. The pair would then dispose of her body using Bunting's named slice and dice method, burying her in 11 plastic bags 1.5 meters above Davies' remains in the garden of the house at Salisbury North. Some people believe that Bunting killed her to stop her from telling Elizabeth Harvey about the affair. However, as the group would continue to collect her pension by concealing her death, it is likely that this was just a lucky break for Bunting and gave him the idea of making a financial profit from his murders for subsequent victims. Once the body had been found, however, the coroner couldn't rule out that she had died from natural causes.
Yeah, so it's who do you believe there? Because, yeah, as I said, the evidence there isn't as clear-cut, but, I mean, he's already got a very clear killer instinct. But like I said, later on, his MO and his people who he tends to go for changes drastically, but by this stage, she is not one of his targets. I guess you could look at it 2 different ways, whether or not she did die of a heart attack and he found her. Disposing of the body, hiding the body so then no one knows she's dead, so he can still collect the checks. Perhaps it makes sense, but it seems to be a bit of an odd one.
And as well, to then go ahead and cut her up into 11 bags when she's had a heart attack. Why not just, if he was worried about finding the body, why not just leave and make an anonymous call?
In September 1997, an acquaintance of Wagner's cousin, Michael Gardiner, who was an openly gay crossdresser, basically, Wagner flew into a rage after finding Gardiner alone playing games with his cousin's children. but he saw Gardiner with his hand over the mouth of one of the kids, which kind of sparked a memory of Wagner when he was abused by having the hand over his mouth. So people think it's probably just really poor timing, and the fact that he kind of saw it was just sheer bad luck. Obviously it's Wagner's account against everyone else's, but people have said Gardiner that wasn't his kind of way. But this immediately made Wagner want to kind of sort him out, seek revenge there and protect his cousin's child. So sometime later, Wagner and Bunting kidnapped Gardiner and strangled and tortured him with a noose, so forcing him to stand in order to stay alive, which would eventually go on to kill him. They forced him to call a friend and say he was going to move north, just to kind of cover their tracks there, and they dumped Gardiner in a barrel of acid in the bank in Snowtown. He was only 19. So the image of having something around your neck, so basically if you get so tired and worn out, but if you can't stand anymore, then it's a horrible thing to picture there.
So 2 things that Tom has just mentioned there, Snowtown and the bank vault. So firstly, Snowtown. Snowtown is a little town approximately 87 miles north of Adelaide. Very, very small town, kind of in the middle of nowhere. And this is where...
Snowwhere Town.
Good stuff.
Thank you, mate.
So there will be another member of Bunting's gang that we'll go on to talk about, which is Mark Ray Hayden. And Mark Ray Hayden had actually been renting an abandoned state bank building in Snowtown, which is a bank building with 4 attached bedrooms, and it also had access to a secure vault. So Bunting saw this as an opportunity to store essentially the bodies in the barrels.
There it is!
And that's what the group would go on to do. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's in kind of a small town where people don't really ask questions, and for a period of time, it really worked for the group.
It
completely undetected.
A vault for storing bodies seems storing something you want to hide from people seems the absolute ideal, doesn't it? Really. So as I said before, it's quite strange that Barry Lane is part of this group. He's completely not someone who Bunting. You can imagine Bunting wanting to hang around. But he apparently was only in the circle to help Bunting keep up to date with the goings-on within the paedophile community. After Lane was accused of molesting a local boy, someone firebombed Lane and Wagner's house, and Bunting told him never to come around again. So Wagner left Lane at this point and began a relationship with a woman who had several children, who he eventually got engaged to. Lane at this time also began dating Thomas Trevelyan and moved in with him in April 1997.
Yeah, just a mixture of different characters with different backgrounds, different lifestyles in the Snowtown movie, like at times. And the actor that plays Bunting is incredible.
Yeah, he's very, very good.
But at times you can just feel the friction between Lane and Bunting, and you're always kind of seeing there's really cool shots of where Bunting's kind of a conversation is happening, but he's just looking at Lane. And it's all kind of boiling up at this point.
A lot of the time as well with that group, it's kind of led by fear of Bunting, and you're not wanting to cross him because you don't want him to turn on you. And
he can fly off the handle.
He can fly off the handle, 100%. But yeah, so Wagner as well there. So Wagner's now left Lane, and he's now with a woman, and I think Bunting would be very approving of that change in his friend, thinking all along that he probably was straight. So there's a big change in Wagner's life there as well.
So on the 17th of October 1997, around the same time, Trevelyan also reported to Bunting that Lane was sexually abusing him. Bunting, Wagner and Trevelyan picked up Lane and forced him to call his mother and tell her that he was moving to Queensland. His mother has later said that she could hear Trevelyan in the background telling Lane what to say. It was also alleged that Lane, you could tell something was going on with the tone of his voice, very croaky as he was trying to talk. The group then tortured him for details of his bank accounts. After crushing his toes with pliers, amongst other torture methods, Lane was strangled to death. The group later disposed of his body using their preferred barrel and acid method. Some people, after this would all come out, and at the time, viewed this as Wagner actually being the driving force behind this one and wanting to carry out revenge on his former abuser and former groomer, the person who had stole, in Wagner's opinion, multiple years of life.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that, as in someone that he kind of realised, and especially probably with Bunting in his ear, how did you live with this man for so long after what he did to you? As well, a little throwback there with the pliers method to Benny, the torturing has gone up a notch. So November 1997, shortly after the murder of Lane, Trevelyan moved in with Wagner, whose girlfriend did not like him, as Trevelyan was a paranoid schizophrenic who suffered from delusions and often dressed up in army fatigues. Trevelyan allegedly attempted to kill Wagner's stepson's puppy, but they were able to stop him. That afternoon, Bunting and Wagner told Jamie that Trevelyan had started to fuck up and go mental, and that he wouldn't risk their operation. So he didn't want him to kind of let on to what they've been doing. He was acting very irrationally, kind of, being very unpredictable. So they didn't want to risk, losing their kind of perfect system they got here now. That, they've killed 3 people now, and,
referring to it as an operation as well. They still view it's kind of going back to that Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe thing. He viewed it as his divine mission. It was ridding the streets of sex workers, whereas John Bunting is viewing it that he's cleaning the streets of predators and paedophiles and homosexuals.
Definitely, 100%. And there's a bit of a god complex, thinking that they're the vigilantes doing what they need to protect in the neighbourhood. So then they took him for a drive. A day later, Trevelyan was found hanging from a tree. Given his past suicide attempts, the coroner ruled his death as suicide. No further investigation was launched. So they would have been aware of this, the fact that he has tried to kill himself before. So then, they haven't gone the barrel method because they felt like they didn't need to, because they could just stage this and people wouldn't ask any questions.
It's just not their MO, is it, to leave a body out in public? I believe it was a trucker that found Trevelyan hanging from the tree. But again, as you said, no real questions were asked. Again, it's the specific kind of victim type, I guess, someone that's not going to be missed, or someone with a sense of vulnerability, or with potentially a suicidal thoughts or a suicidal history. So there you have it. April 1998, 31-year-old Gavin Porter, a diagnosed schizophrenic who had spent many years in mental institutions, met 17-year-old Jamie and moved in with him. The pair kind of struck up a bond because both of them were heroin addicts, and it's important to note as well, Bunting could not stand drugs or drug addicts, though he would tolerate it with Jamie.
So Jamie obviously having such a heart, he kind of try to cope with the trauma in his life with drinking and self-medicating with drugs, and obviously he's got to the stage of heroin here. The one thing I find with this as well, this whole story, is how open door policy people's houses are. The amount of times people move in with people. I mean, in the house with Bunting and Jamie, the amount of times people just kind of move in there and live there for a while and then kind of drift out is very bizarre.
So during this time, obviously, Gavin Porter moves in with Jamie, Elizabeth and Bunting decides that he should be the group's next victim after he was pricked by a discarded syringe Porter had left in the living room. Bunting's someone who's quite quick to anger as it goes.
It's kind of the equivalent of stepping on Lego, but
in a way.
In a lot darker way.
Yeah. And this particular one was one of the ones that I mentioned. The Crime Investigation Australia reenactment was particularly brutal. The guy playing Bunting, which was quite distracting, looked a little bit like Jack Black.
Not a big fan of Jack Black.
And I think they were particularly trying to emphasise the fact that Bunting was a man's man. And I did notice that in the corner of one of the rooms Bunting was in, he had a boob mug.
Boob mug?
Yeah, so...
Was the same one you have, or...?
On the evening of his death, Porter was working in his car under the influence of drugs. He fell asleep on the back seat and was awoken by Bunting and Wagner attacking him with a rope around his neck. And as he kind of awoke to a panic, he grabbed a nearby screwdriver and stabbed Bunting in the hand. This, however, only served to fuel Bunting's kind of aggression further, and they overpowered Porter and strangled him to death. They then showed Porter's dead body to Jamie before disposing of it into a barrel.
So obviously Jamie's friends with Porter, so this is a very kind of disturbing time for Jamie, and obviously it looks as Bunting as a kind of a father figure. He'd be very intimidated with Bunting as well, knowing if you get the wrong side of him what exactly could happen. So this is a very kind of mentally difficult situation to go through. It's very traumatic in itself. Yeah, as well, just to highlight Bunting and Wagner in terms of, Bunting was quite a small guy. As Ben mentioned earlier on with Wagner, he's very tall and muscular, known as Lurch. They're kind of like a, he's the brains and he's the muscle, essentially. With Wagner there, it'd be very hard to overpower. especially both of them together.
Bunting also just so much anger in him, so much aggression in him that he would just lash out. And a lot of these, well, almost all of them, completely unprovoked, completely out of nowhere. Even sometimes as they were attacking their victims, they would often fight each other as well, not to kill their victims too quickly. So they'd start lashing out at each other. It was just a frenzied series of attacks.
And as we said before, with Bunting not having the sense of smell, he would often take a lot of joy by looking into the barrels and obviously not smelling the bodies, but seeing how far along they were in the rotting process. He got a lot of pleasure out of that, which I think Wagner, you didn't really partake in that because of the smell. Apparently it was so putrid. Yeah, it's a horrible thought.
On the odours that were emanating from the barrels, the barrels look like the kind of Breaking Bad style barrels where you're going to store money and bury it, or store
oil drums,
or dissolve a body. Yeah, the group, whether this is intentional or not, and Bunting actually wanted to preserve the victims' bodies, they used hydrochloric acid. If they actually wanted to dissolve the bodies, they should have used, or could have used, sulfuric acid.
So the top tip there from Ben. August 1998, Jamie confided in Bunting that he had been sexually abused by his half-brother, Troy, when he was 14. So Troy himself had been abused as well, growing up. So this obviously made Bunting angry, as we know how his feeling is towards anyone sexually assaulting or any gay activity as well. So he decided the best course of action was to get Troy. So Bunting and Wagner and Hayden woke Jamie up one night and told him they were going to get Troy. They then tied Troy up, tortured him and put him in a bath where they beat him again and forced him to give them financial details. They also forced him to record phrases so they could send his friends messages to keep up the pretense that he was alive. This bit's really twisted and kind of shows just the kind of God complex that Bunting had. They made him call them by the names Sir, God, Master and Chief Inspector. And then what they do is they crush his toes with pliers if he ever used the incorrect names. They finally strangled him to death. They took Troy's body to a barrel. In fact, he was too large for the barrel, but this didn't at all faze Bunting as he proceeded to cut Troy's feet off to ensure he would fit. So just to kind of take a step back on this slightly, this is Jamie's half-brother. Obviously, Troy abused Jamie when he was growing up, but he is his half-brother. So that's a very kind of in itself a very hard relationship anyway.
Yeah, and it could be argued with Troy as well that was like learned behaviour from their stepfathers.
Yeah,
and he was simply doing it because that was what you do.
Yeah, exactly. We don't know the exact kind of
not defending Troy at all, but
totally. Yeah. So Jamie, obviously, he must fear Bunting as well as much as he kind of admires him. So he wouldn't have felt it was within his power to stop this happening. And again, obviously, Troy is Elizabeth Harvey's son. This is in her house. Suddenly her son goes missing, but this doesn't seem to make a big song and dance about it. And obviously she was involved with one of the early murders, so she knows exactly what Bunting's capable of. So she's just scared. I feel like she must have, smelled a rat.
Yeah, in the back of her mind, she must have thought, at least had the idea that Bunting was responsible. But obviously they'd made him record those different voice messages.
Yeah.
Fairly aggressive from what we understand. So who knows? There's loads of conjecture with this case, loads of different people involved, and it's just so sad that obviously that whole, they're now escalating to the point of killing relatives as well. Now, anyone's a possible target. So September 1998, Bunting became involved with a woman called Gail Sinclair. Gail had a son who was 17-year-old Fred Brooks. And this is an interesting part because Fred didn't warm to Bunting whatsoever. He didn't like him from the off, sensed that something wasn't quite right about Bunting. And this really rubbed Bunting the wrong way. Fred wasn't Bunting's usual kind of MO in terms of the type of victim he'd look for or the type of individual he'd want to attack or torment. He was not an abuser of children. He was not a sex offender. He was not a drug user. To kind of bypass this, Bunting began to spread rumours that Fred Brooks was being inappropriate with young girls, telling people in the gang that something had to happen to Fred Brooks. And on the day that Brooks found out he had been accepted into the Air Force Cadets, he decided to pass on an invite to a party celebrating that achievement in favour of joining Bunting, Wagner and Jamie in a break and enter.
So break and enter, robbing people's houses essentially. I find this bit all a bit bizarre because, as we said, Fred's quite straight-laced. He's going to the Air Force Cadets. and then he's, rather than going to a party to celebrate it, he's going to meet someone he doesn't like to go robbing. It just doesn't feel...
Yeah, and he's got a fairly good moral compass, his good perception about other people, and maybe a good judge of character, but that's kind of let him down in this instance.
Yeah, he didn't smell a rat, the rat couldn't smell.
So this is, again, there's lots of twists and turns and kind of layers to this case, but this one has elements of John Wayne Gacy to it because there is a handcuff trick.
Or a thumb cuff trick.
I was going to thumb war you. It's like being in thumb cuffs with me because I'm good.
Or what?
It's no what's. It's no what's, guys. Just could zoom in.
Ben, edit some warts on there.
Don't edit some warts. So once at Bunting's house, Brooks was challenged to try on a pair of thumb cuffs. Basically, the group had been passing them around, breaking out of them, and they wanted to make sure that had they been put in a position to wear thumb cuffs, that all of them were okay to escape if they, potentially were caught by the police. Brooks puts himself in the cuffs and he can't get out. And it's at this point that he is immediately attacked by the group, and savagely attacked, in fact. They bind him and they start to torture him through particularly brutal methods, including cigarettes being stubbed out on his nose and on his ears, and having smiley faces burnt into his forehead with a lighter.
So with that, just a bit of a throwback, I remember smileys being a thing which the cool kids at school would seem to think it was a cool thing to do, where you just basically you burn your lighter for a while so it's hot on the metal, and then you put it against your skin and it would basically burn you, and it leaves a little mark resembling a smiley face. Obviously don't do that. Never do that. It's stupid.
Use a match. Don't. It's just light relief. And this is particularly dark. So as well as having already burnt Brooks, Bunting decides to insert a sparkler into his urethra and then light it. As well as this, his toes were also crushed and he was left to choke to death on his gag. And this is someone that, wasn't typically Bunting's MO. He hadn't offended, he hadn't abused anybody. He simply didn't really warm to Bunting, as far as we know.
Yeah. So he's got the most severe, well, you could argue the most severe torture on him comparatively to other people who in Bunting's head would have far more deserved it. But it seems to be Bunting is escalating now with how severe these are getting. He's still trying to outdo himself with the kind of techniques he's doing. It's horrible.
So as well as inserting the sparkler into Brooks's urethra and lighting it, as well as crushing his toes, the gang also attached electronic devices to Brooks's testicles and penis and gave electric shocks there. They also injected his testicles with water, which is just cruel and unusual.
All of that is very, very bizarre. And horrible the pain that would have caused.
Yeah. He's not committed any harm to anyone. He simply didn't warm to Bunting, and Bunting has obviously carried out or led the group to conduct the most brutal of murders.
Yes.
Brooks was eventually left to choke to death on his own gag. And I think in the reenactment as well, which again all of them are absolutely brutal, but they're fighting with each other because they're like, careful, if you keep doing that you'll kill him. They wanted to preserve it and prolong the suffering, which is just absolutely grim. So as a result of this, Gail reports her son missing, but was then told by Bunting that he had seen Fred in town under the influence. He then played a recording that they actually had forced Fred to conduct to his mother, which actually was an angry goodbye message. How Bunting just happens to have that on his person is kind of strange.
Yeah, and it's kind of strange that they went for the idea of recording messages rather than doing handwritten notes or things like that.
Yeah.
And then, the Gael would go on to call the police and basically call off the search there. So again, Wagner and Bunting getting away with murder there, and they think they're untouchable.
And as often is the case, they go through a few years of getting away with murder. They do start to feel more powerful than ever, untouchable, and this is just escalating more and more in their behaviours. It's almost to the point where now Bunting he's already quite an arrogant individual, but he's now extremely arrogant in what he attempts to do next.
So during this time, the police were investigating Barry Lane's disappearance. They discovered that withdrawals were being made on Lane's account at the ATM at the same service station every pension day. They installed surveillance cameras and got footage of Wagner making the withdrawals. So through his links with Bunting, both were now put under surveillance and had their telephones tapped.
Smart. 3 years ago, the very first victim, Clinton Trezise, because withdrawals were still being made on Clinton's welfare payments, they assumed that he was still alive, but they never investigated it further. 3 years. It took his own mother to realise, I've not heard from Clinton in a while. But had they have realised that sooner, maybe all of this could have been tied back to Bunting immediately.
Yeah, I mean, you would have thought if a lot of times they assume that he's left town, so why the withdrawal's being made in the town that he's left? Seems to be a fairly suspect thing, but I guess, yeah, there's a lot of times in this where you think police could perhaps stepped in, but it was kind of, small towns, small communities. People did kind of come and go.
So November 1998, and this is the one that I found particularly upsetting. Gary O'Dwyer, an intellectually and physically disabled man, picked simply because he resembled Troy and possibly looked gay, was tortured in his own home by Bunting, Wagner and Jamie. The really sad one about this is that Bunting, Wagner and Jamie basically befriended him. They saw him because he walked with a limp. They saw him walking down the street. They offered him, an invite to come round and have some drinks. And Gary simply thought, I've made some new friends.
Exactly, because he didn't have many friends, so he was very keen to make friends. And so, these people seem nice, very trusting. They essentially saw someone who looked very vulnerable and decided to pounce.
Exactly. And from Bunting, again, if he's leading this potential attack, then he's seeing some resemblance of Troy, the fact that he possibly looked gay, how he's come to that conclusion. So they convince him into the car. They drive back to Mark Hayden's home where they strangle him to death and put his body into a barrel. Gary O'Dwyer had simply befriended Jamie and hosted drinks for the trio before they decided to turn on him. And again, he's just sat in a chair. They're all having a good time, and then Bunting strikes from behind him.
So around this time, Hayden told Bunting that he had told his wife Elizabeth Hayden about the murders, which is a very bizarre thing to do, admit to Bunting that you've done that. So apparently Bunting hated Elizabeth and planned to kill her whilst Mark was kept busy in the city by another one of his acquaintances. Bunting and Jamie strangled Elizabeth in her bath. So when Mark Hayden returned, over 2 hours later, Bunting had told him that he had spurned Elizabeth's sexual advances, so she had stormed out of the house. Again, Hayden knowing exactly what they'd been up to before, I'm sure it wouldn't have taken long to put two and two together there.
It was also weird because Bunting was such an elaborate liar that he said, not only did I spurn her advances and she left, but he goes, she ran upstairs, went into her room, and then left via the window for me rejecting her.
It's always a thing, if you lie, too many details is always a clear thing of a lie. Eventually, Hayden's wife was reported missing by her brother. Police found it strange that she had not been reported missing by her husband. That is very strange. They soon linked her disappearance to Bunting and Wagner. Obviously, we said before that the police are currently kind of keeping an eye on them anyway, and raided Hayden's house, including the shed where the barrels had previously been kept. So the police are starting to hone in on them now.
Several months later, Bunting's friends told him that they were moving to Snowtown, and he asked them to take the barrels with them. They agreed, but told him that the barrels were starting to smell and to come and get them. Bunting and Hayden, imagine what's going through there. Imagine that as well. All the evidence in those barrels is just driven away with his friends. They don't know what's going on. I assume that they've not questioned the smell. Well,
that's what they're saying to them. Go get them. They smell too much, aren't they? Essentially, it's obviously he had the kangaroo. He said before there's kangaroos in there, kangaroo bodies. Very bizarre.
So there you go. So immediately Bunting and Hayden travel to Snowtown, where they then sign a lease for the house and adjoining unused bank, which would obviously later go on to become infamous, and they moved the barrels into the vault belonging to the bank. Ironically, the bank building was next door to the local police station.
That is bold.
Skating on thin ice.
They are indeed. If the police were to go in the vault, then they'd have them over a barrel there, wouldn't they? Really? Brilliant. Thank you. May 1999. This is the final victim, David Johnson, who was Jamie's new stepbrother. Elizabeth had begun a relationship with his father, Marcus. Bunting didn't like him because, in Bunting's mind, he was a yuppie. Bunting would often refer to him using homophobic slurs and said that he needed to die. He was lured to the Snowtown bank on the pretense of buying a computer because, weirdly, Bunting was trying to explain to people that he used that space for swapping and selling computers, which is very, again, bizarre. Johnson was tortured by Bunting for his bank information. Jamie and Wagner took his card to an ATM and attempted to withdraw money, but were unsuccessful. By the time they had returned, Bunting had already killed Johnson. Bunting claimed that Johnson had overpowered him and he had no choice. This annoyed Wagner because he felt cheated out of the torture. So Wagner cut a piece of flesh from Johnson's body, and the trio later returned to Adelaide, where Wagner and Bunting cooked and ate the flesh. Johnson was the only victim to have actually been killed in Snowtown. So again, another escalation there to actually eating the victim.
Yeah, and another kind of target to add to Bunting's list, yuppie. So homosexuals, paedophiles, drug users, people that look like Troy, and yuppies.
And people that just don't like him a bit.
And people that don't warm to him quick enough.
So 20th of May 1999, the police launched an investigation into the disappearances of 5 of the victims. So the Elizabeth Hayden disappearance is the kind of thing that kind of prompted this, which led them to the disused bank, where they discovered 5 barrels of the body parts of 8 people in acid in a vault, which the stench apparently was unbelievable, as you can imagine. Like earlier on, producer Dan discovered a rotten cake he left in his bag in Tupperware, and that smell.
Yeah, I smelled it before I saw it.
Yeah. So imagine a barrel. Isn't that true, Dan?
No, don't know what you're talking about.
And that was stomach churning.
Overwhelming.
Yeah.
The scene itself as well. So they'd used bin bags to tape off certain windows and doors, so they'd enclosed all of that.
Yeah.
Musk.
Moisture.
So if I'm an officer and I'm arriving at that scene, for me,
you're at your depth.
I'm out of my depth already. I'm securing the premises. I'm not.
You shouldn't be anywhere near it. You should be just outside, maybe saying to the local people, "Oh, the real policemen are in there doing the job. I'm just please, guys, can you stay back? But thank you."
One particular officer was like, despite obviously in your head, you're aware loads of people have gone missing. You're aware of the type of people, because they were tracking these people for quite some time now. You found some barrels in a vault that, stink. One of the officers went straight up and immediately lifted one of the lids.
You have to.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it could have just been kangaroos.
Exactly, shot with illegal weapons. You don't
want to jump to conclusions.
So the next day, the 21st of May 1999, Bunting, Wagner, Jamie and Mark Hayden were arrested and charged with the murders of the bodies in the barrels. Police investigations led them to a total of 12 potential victims across a 7-year timeline, although they would only be convicted of the murder of 11 of them.
So yeah, I mean, a couple of these, as we said, the staged suicide and also the possible heart attack, which we're not sure if that happened. So that's the timeline. Then we're going to go into the aftermath now.
So as they're arrested, the case itself generates global attention, but large amount of...
in the universe, like.
Did you hear about the murders in Snowtown? Is that a village? No, you idiot. It's a town in the name.
It's what the aliens were saying.
So John Bunting, Robert Wagner, Mark Hayden and Jamie Vlasakis were all taken into custody. And as news starts to kind of filter through to mainstream media, it becomes a national sensation, one of the biggest and longest crime sprees in Australian history. And the trial also, kind of backs that up in terms of the size of it, the length of it. The trial itself lasted almost 12 months, which is the longest in the history of South Australia. And one particularly interesting part is that when the group were brought to sentencing, they all remained completely silent. None of them would enter a plea at all. They wouldn't say a word. So they, on the fact that they were silent, they assumed, or they took it that would stand for not guilty.
And just to kind of highlight how long this procedure was, it actually cost 17 million. This whole kind of court proceedings and legal costs. That is a lot of bunts. A lot of bunts.
So in December of 2003, Bunting was convicted of committing 11 murders and Wagner was convicted of committing 10 murders, of which he had only confessed to 3 of those. Jamie Vlasakis pleaded guilty to 4 of the murders, and we'll get onto him shortly. And in 2004, Mark Hayden was convicted on 5 counts of assisting with the murders, of which he only admitted to 2 of them. Yeah, very, very long trial. And Jamie Vlasakis was actually on the stand for, I believe, 22 days.
He obviously quite a lot younger. They targeted him as being the person that was going to break. Obviously, Wagner and Bunting very strong-minded. The main ringleaders really of the group, so they probably think they couldn't crack him, but they thought Jamie would be the way through there. Jamie was quite quick to turn on his co-conspirators, providing the investigators with over 2,000 pages of transcript in his second interview, naming motives, the crimes, and the victims. He was also granted a suppression order, keeping his name and image out of the media, for him providing the evidence there, and he made an 800-page police statement. The term, people say, sung like a canary.
That's a choir of canaries.
That is definitely, Ben, you're right there.
Thank you. Justice Brian Ross Martin determined that Bunting was the ringleader and sentenced him to 11 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of release. Wagner was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences under the same conditions, and at his sentencing, he stated from the dock, "Paedophiles were doing terrible things to children. The authorities didn't do anything about it. I decided to take action, and I took that action. Thank you." Jamie Vlasakis was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences with a non-parole period of 26 years. So I think that basically means he has to serve a minimum of 26 years despite giving all that information.
Yeah.
I think one thing I read was that they approached Jamie Vlasakis for what information he had on the grounds that might support his a more lenient sentence, but obviously all that talking hasn't really helped. And Mark Hayden, who was convicted on 5 counts of assisting murders, was sentenced to 25 years with a non-parole period of 18 years.
Yeah, so with this case being, like Ben said, so big and so gruesome, there was more than 250 suppression orders, which would basically prevent publication of the details of the case, I guess because copycats and things like that. But in early 2011, a judge lifted the remaining orders in response to a request by the producers of the film Snowtown. So they're able to dramatise that and kind of go into the details of it a lot more. Snowtown, obviously, being affiliated with all this crime, became a kind of morbid, like, dark tourism spot. People going to the bank and wanted to see the bank. Snowtown actually were rumoured to want to change the name of the town to Rosetown. That's not probably the name I'd go for, but they didn't do it anyway in the end. And apparently, like, some of the locals would stop saying they're from Snowtown now because of just sort of the kind of link to it. They just say the mid-north instead.
So, I mean, in terms of a motive, the motive, as we mentioned, it kind of changed as the case progressed and as their numbers increased. But in terms of searching for a clear motive based on Jamie Vlasakis' testimonies, it's believed that initially the motive was that to rid the streets of paedophiles, homosexuals, or people that were weak.
People that were weak is like, that's... Yeah. I guess that's kind of, if they're going back to the Nazi kind of ideology. Yeah, at the beginning, they were like, oh no, we're just, like Wagner says in his kind of testimony at the docks, he's like, we were killing paedophiles because...
I'm here because the police did nothing.
Yeah.
Motive changed as the case went on. The group are regarded as thrill killers. So as they claimed more victims, obviously Bunting, particularly towards the end when he's literally just picking off people for not really warming to him or not coming to his, not spurning his advances.
Yeah.
Financial gain, a power, the fact that they are anti-authority, and they believe that they were ridding the streets of paedophiles and homosexuals. There's a lot of kind of similarities with Bunting and Charles Manson, I found, in terms of manipulating people to do, people that were potentially less intelligent than him, taking advantage of them to carry out actions on his behalf, manipulating young people with alcohol and drugs.
I guess as well, there's a lot of outcasts that he kind of made them feel like they were part of something, which obviously was a horrible dark thing he made them feel part of. But yeah, it's a horrifying case. And, for people that haven't seen the movie, definitely recommend it. It's a great film. Just to kind of highlight how dark this was, obviously the director was able to obtain a lot of the information about the case that was, originally away from the public. And then he said he'd research this before going to bed and have the most vivid, horrible nightmares. And one of the policemen who went to the crime scene said it was a scene from the worst nightmare you've ever had. I don't think any of us were prepared to see what we saw. But yeah, I recommend people watching the film. It is very good.
Yeah, it's a harrowing watch. You're interested in things like this, Tom. So in terms of the bank, after holding an open house, the bank with a 4-bedroom attached house was placed on auction in February of 2012, but only reached half of its reserve price of $200,000. So the community then raised $700 for charity through charging an entrance fee, and the property sold later that year for just over $185,000. The new owners intended to live in the house while running a business from the bank. They stated that they would install a plaque in commemoration of the victims. I wouldn't be able to live in The house that John Bunting lived in and buried 2 bodies in the garden of was demolished by its new owners, the South Australian Housing Trust.
So yeah, they're all obviously still serving their time now in prison. Very unlikely any of them will get out. This is the time of the episode where we tend to do our looky-likeys. I've only got one for Wagner. I think, Ben, you've got one for...
I've got a few for Bunting.
Go on then.
Shall I go for it?
Yeah, you go for it.
I wrote here as well, a lot of stick for me having too many in the first 2 episodes, so I've kept it short. And then I've not...
Because they're not... If they don't look anything like them, then you'll get stick.
So of the 3, I mean, John Bunting and Mark Hayden look in the lineup like really close, and Wagner is clearly the odd one out. For John Bunting, I've gone for a small, skinny Keith from the UK office.
Because he's got a beard.
And little glasses and that.
Beard and glasses, yeah.
John Bunting also looks like superhuman. Massive wrestling fan and stuntman. He jumps off things and jumps through.
Stuntman, he's just a Twitter guy that does things to harm himself and people retweet it.
Looks a little bit like John Bunting. This one is probably my favourite one. He looks like the guy from I'm Just Waiting for a Mate.
That's probably the best one.
Thank you.
And he's Aussie as well, isn't he?
And he's Aussie as well.
How'd the collision with your car happen, mate?
What collision?
Well, the one that's got all your wheels and stuff twisted up and your front bumper bars hanging off, mate.
Well, I'm just waiting for a mate, as I said.
Who's your mate?
Hey?
Who's your mate?
James.
Also a little bit of Ringo Starr.
No, you lost me again.
Okay. And I also just couldn't get over when in the picture of them being brought into court or into the docks, just the height difference between Wagner and Bunting.
Wagner flips the bird.
Yes, yeah. For Mark Hayden, it kind of looks a little bit like a Charles Manson and Saddam Hussein hybrid. And for Robert Wagner, a tiny bit of Louis C.K. Just a tiny bit.
So I got Wagner looks like a young Pat Roach, who has played Bomber in Alfie Indra and Pet. Very niche. I struggled because I think Bunting just looks like an everyday guy.
Definitely.
So it's kind of hard to pinpoint.
Thought.
Yeah, it is a scary thought. But yeah, that is the case of the Snowtown Murders, all the bodies in the barrel.
Don't feel good. Feel like I felt after I watched the film. Just need to go for a long walk and fruit juice.
Fruit juice.
Just have a 5 Alive.
So if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to give us a like and a subscribe. And why not hit the notification bell so you know when the episodes come out? It helps us an awful lot.
Absolutely. This is episode 3 of a 12-episode series, so we got lots more in store. We can't wait to share the forthcoming episodes with you. Thank you so much for everyone that's been there from the beginning. Thank you for people that are kind of just discovering us for the first time. We really appreciate all of the feedback. Message us on Instagram, Facebook, Patreon. Leave us a comment on YouTube. We like to, with the guys that don't ever ignore. We never ignore. That's
bold.
Sometimes we might miss.
Or delete comments.
As always, on the socials, @CouldMurderAPod, feel free to give us a message. If you're an audio listener, every episode has a visual version of it on YouTube, so why not check that out?
Yeah, and be sure to give us a review if you listen to iTunes, or if you follow the page on Spotify. It really helps us for the audio listeners. Thank you very much, guys, and
tell your friends.
Tell your friends. And like we always say, guys, that's usually when you say.
Wait, is that me?
Huh?
I thought...
we say this all the time.
You didn't say keep doing what you're doing.
I said, like we always say, guys. We say this all the time. I say keep doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
And like we always say, guys.
We say this all the time.
Keep doing what you're doing.
Unless it's, renting out banks and...
You can rent out a bank, that's fine, but...
illegal weapons, kangaroos.
Bodies in the barrel. Take care, guys.
See you next week.